Yes.
This is, I'm talking to my friend Tapen Sinha, whom I have known for about 40 years. I want to talk to him about his life journey. He is one of amongst my friends at least, he has had the most eventful, colorful and longest journey, making several hops. So Tapen, where do we begin? Let's begin how did you end up being an ISI?
Okay, so I was born in Calcutta. Actually, I lived in Behala. As a matter of fact, I was born in Khidipur Post Office, as I'd like to say. I was delivered in Khidipur Post Office, which was a nursing home that became a post office. And then I studied in Behala High School, and for a short while there I joined the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur. But it didn't quite work out, and so I ended up in ISI.
So, as you all know, I mean, the ISI program is bachelor's and then followed by Master of Statistics. And so you learn the whole lot of mathematics, statistics and so on.
I did.
And yet in the final year of our program you chose to move to economics. Was it a thought out decision? Was it just to be daringly different as you like to be? Or
Well, looking back, I thought I had just too much of statistics. I wanted to learn something somewhat different, related but somewhat different. So that was part of the reason. And second was, since my brother did study economics, so I really wanted to see what that thing is all about.
I see. So it was partly that, partly this, like
Yes.
that. Okay.
Yes.
And but that was your last move. So then you're stuck to economics since then, more or less.
Well, yeah.
And then you joined at ISI as a PhD student.
That's correct.
And what was it? 1 year, 1.5 years, or
No,
something?
just 1 year.
Just 1 year.
Just 1 year.
And then you went to the US.
Yeah, actually, when I joined ISI as a JRF, it wasn't very clear that they would admit me as a JRF. So at first I went to Presidency College, the Presidency College, now Presidency University, and I was there first for a month and a half as a junior research fellow.
I see.
And then Deepak Banerjee was the head of the department, so I went and talked to him. I asked him, how do we go about doing research? He said, well, just pick up any paper, read it, and then go in the reference list, and if you find 10 papers, and then read those, and then you go. So I said, well, in that case, after 3 steps, I'll have 1,111 papers. How do I handle that? He didn't have a very convincing answer to me, so when ISI offered me a JRF, I just jumped. I just went back to ISI. And then I worked with Dipankar Dasgupta. It wasn't exactly going the way I thought it was going to. Then I was thinking about one problem, and then I thought, I had sort of a solution. I mean, I knew, I sort of thought that there was a solution. Then I actually came to you and asked you, how do I go about solving this? It was a hyperplane thing. Then you gave me a solution. And so with that, I went to Dipankar Dasgupta and told him that I have solved this problem. He said, it's not possible. And then I showed him the solution. And then he was partly convinced that it could be. And he came up with another solution, and then we jointly wrote a paper.
Okay. I see.
That's how my research started. Yes.
And then you went to, a year later, you went to Minneapolis.
Yeah.
So, Minnesota Economics Department had several stars, right?
Yes. Actually, I didn't know a great deal about the stars
when you chose.
When I went there. Even after I went there, people will tell me names, and I would just draw a blank face because I just didn't know them. I mean, I was not familiar with the mainstream economics. Of course, then I knew about them, and it turned out that 4 of them won Nobel Prize and so on and so forth. So, that was sort of more of a luck rather than by choice. Yes. The reason why I went to Minnesota, I had several admissions. The 2 top options I had was Minnesota or Berkeley. Berkeley gave me a quarter-time fellowship, and I said, with that I cannot get a visa. They won't give me a visa. And Minnesota gave me a half-time fellowship.
I see.
And so I chose Minnesota.
I see. And So let's fast forward. After your PhD, what did you do?
Okay, so while I was doing my PhD, I started on this thing called what I termed as theory of uncertain lifetimes. So basically it was trying to understand the annuities market. And at that time, people really didn't have a good deal of theory behind it. There were some papers in economics in that, but it was more of really hardcore theory rather than applying it to the markets per se. So what I wanted to do is sort of get an interplay of the two. And I started working on one professor in Minnesota, Oz Brownlee, and in the process, after I started my thesis, he contracted cancer and died. So, and then I took my thing around to other people, and they said, oh, this is not very interesting. So I had to basically start all over again to do that. And by that time, I had already gotten a job, and I have moved away from Minneapolis, so I'd come every weekend to Minneapolis and do my stuff and then go back. It was hard getting the PhD done. So that was very tough. But eventually I did get done, and by the time I got done, I was teaching in the University of Wisconsin, one of the smaller campuses. And then, as luck would have it, one of my colleagues who was married to a Singaporean and who was going on sabbatical to Singapore. So I said, where are you going exactly? He said, this is called National University of Singapore. And he actually said, well, why don't you write them a letter and see what they say? So I wrote them a letter, and then they asked me they would do an interview. So I went to Washington to do an interview with some guy who was at the National University. And the first thing he says, why do you want to go to Singapore? I left there. It's not a very good place to
The one who is interviewing you for the job.
I was shocked. But anyway, I thought, Singapore would be 4 hours from Calcutta by flight.
Yeah.
So I could have breakfast in Singapore and have lunch with my mother in Calcutta. So that was a big draw. And so I took the job in Singapore. That's how I landed up in Singapore.
I see. So how many years were you in Singapore?
Almost 3 years. And then there was one visitor who came in who was passing through Singapore. He was actually a Singaporean. And I was teaching a higher level class, and then the head of the department said, could you let him come and give a talk in your class? I said, sure, it's decision making under uncertainty, so that's the kind of stuff I was teaching. So he gave a talk, and then I took him out to lunch, and at lunch I asked him, are you visiting your folks here, or why are you here? He said, no, actually I'm coming back from Australia, and they're starting this private university in Australia. So I just half-jokingly asked him if they had a job opening. He said, yes, they are actually hiring people. Why don't you write a letter to such and such? Actually, you can send an email. Those are the early days of email, but you can send him an email. And if Steve Johnson, he's the dean of the School of Business and Law. At that time, they had it in one single school, which I did. I sent him an email. And next thing I know, I get a phone call from Steve Johnson saying, oh, you are a Harvard student. And my stuff is all about incentive compatibility, all the Harvard stuff. So you are welcome to come here, and why don't you come for a visit? So he sends me a plane ticket. I'd never been to Australia. I said, okay, go and see. And so I went there, and I just loved the place.
And yet you spent a relatively short time there to go on again.
No, actually, I stayed there, I went there to the university at day -1, even before the university started. So we designed all the courses. So for example, I designed their program for actuarial science. And part of finance. So that's, when after I went there in 1989, and then I left in 1996. So I'd been there for good 7 years.
Good 7 years, I see.
Yeah.
So when was your next stop? How did it come about?
Actually, again, that was purely by accident. I was at a conference of the American Economic Association in San Francisco, and I was going to meet a friend of mine who was also attending the conference and presenting papers. He said, oh, it gets very crowded, why don't you save me a seat at the place downstairs? So I was saving him a seat, and he never showed up. And then there was this guy walking around with his tray looking for a place to sit. So I said, my friend is not coming. You want to sit? Come and sit down. So we came and sat down. We started chatting. Turned out he was the dean of ETAM school. And he said, do you know about ETAM? No idea. So he said, well, we are a small private university. We are having this 50th anniversary and we are inviting people from all over the world to come and give talks. Would you like to come and give a talk? I said, sure. I've never been to Mexico before. So I went. And again, when I landed on the place, I just loved it. I said, if Calcutta really beautifies, it will look like Mexico City. So that's how, I ended up with the job.
And that was 96?
End of 96, I joined. Actually, I did the interview in 95. And then I was teaching this executive education program where I had everything chalked out until the end of 96. So, I was actually looking for a job as such. So he said, we would like to give you a job and it will be a chair professorship and you can do research on pension, which I was interested in, and they were privatizing pension right at that moment. In Mexico. So I thought that would be a great place to go and get in the ground level for doing research in a country where nobody is thinking about these sorts of things. So I started collecting data from day one.
I see.
And so I told him yes, but I'm committed for the next 1 year. He said, no rush. You come at the end of next year, that's fine with us. But you have to tell me that you will be there for a few years at least so that we can get our money's worth of hiring you. If you go off after 1 year, then it's not worth our while. So you should make up your mind that you're going to be there for at least some time. And so that's how I ended up.
So at different time points you have told me about various interesting and important of the world-seeing personalities you have met. So let's talk about a few.
Well, it actually started out back in Australia. We started a new university and they were going to hire the new vice chancellor and president of the university. And so they hired this guy called Phil Lader, who was a president of a small university in South Carolina. And I knew he had dabbled in politics. He actually ran for governorship of South Carolina and lost. He was a Democratic candidate, so not surprisingly he lost.
In South Carolina, yes, not surprising at all.
Yeah. So he lost, and then and he had a lot of debt. So he took this job, which paid fairly well, and so he became our vice chancellor. And then he was helping one candidate who was running for primaries for the U.S. presidency. And then he got the nomination for the Democratic candidate and eventually won the presidency, Bill Clinton. And he and Bill Clinton, they were both Rhodes Scholars in UK at the same time. So he knew Bill from graduate school. I mean, they did their JD from Harvard, and then they went there together. So they had a long history. And then as soon as Bill became the president, then he hired his friend, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House. So in fact, one time I went to Washington after he moved to Washington, then he gave me the grand tour of the White House where the visitors cannot go. And he wrote a letter of recommendation for me to go to ETAM, and that came with a letterhead of the White House. And then once I joined ETAM, ETAM is a small elite private university in Mexico. And in fact, of the last seven finance minister, 6 were from ETAM. So, we had good deal of connection with the government, so these people came and went. So I got to know some of these people. So for example, one time we had this student evaluation that the professor would go and give it to the class, to somebody else's class. So I had to give one at 7 o'clock in the morning. I didn't even read who the instructor was. So I was just going to the room, and then 2 guys stopped me and said, "Where are you going?" Just going to give the student evaluation, and in this commotion the instructor comes out, and then I realized he was the head of the central bank in Mexico. He was giving a class on monetary theory, of course. He had a PhD from MIT, so he was eminently qualified. So, then by and large I met people like that. And then I got on several committees in Mexico, government-related things. And then I got to meet President of Mexico and so on. And then in that connection, I went to several other countries in South America and so on, and then got to meet the presidents there too.
Wow. So, I know of another friend who meets the president, but only one. You have met several.
Yes.
You have also been asked you are called upon to testify in some parliamentary committees in Mexico,
Yes,
right?
yes. Well, that I, it started again in Australia.
I see.
So they were in the process of privatizing pension at that time, and so you make a submission, and one of the papers I did was about that. It was funded by the Australian Tax Office. And after I wrote the paper, Australian Tax Office said, we will have nothing to do with your paper because we do not agree with your conclusions. Anyway, but that got press, and so this thing got noticed. So one of the senators called me and said, we want you to come and testify in the parliamentary committee and so on. So
started in Australia.
It started in Australia. And then in Mexico, since I started a small center for pension research, which was the first pension research in Mexico, at a university. And I started doing empirical research with Mexican data. So I was in constant demand for going and testifying, saying what's happening on the ground. Because most of the time, these kinds of things are talked about by the industry people who have an axe to grind. I have absolutely no axe to grind. I get no money from anybody, so I could give my independent, honest opinion. And that they valued and they still value.
Yes. Maybe since you have come up, your paths have crossed the current Indian finance minister, maybe they would call upon you to testify in another such hearing too. Well,
we have to see. But I did meet Mr. Arun Jaitley back in 2003. I did a short stint for 7 months during my sabbatical at that time, and worked with IRDA and started the Indian Institute of Risk Management. I was the first director there. And at that time, I had we had a private meeting with Mr. Jaitley and his team, and his vision of where the insurance industry should be going. Of course, by the time I got here, the government fell, and
all that was put on hold. Maybe they are kickstarting that now.
Yes, given that now they are, they have already raised the stake of the foreign, the foreign holding. So I see that as a positive direction. So maybe they will take up the same things that they were planning back then.
Yes. Yeah. So let's hope something like this works out and you come more often to India and contribute to the Indian policy making as well. Having contributed elsewhere, we would love if you can and could contribute to the Indian policy making as well. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
May you meet more presidents and come back and tell me about them.